What's up, my friends north of the border? A lot of you asked me to react to a video on the Halifax explosion, and it's definitely something I've been meaning to get to and I'm interested in, but it is also a topic that I'm not completely unfamiliar with. I have studied a lot of World War One history. I'm extremely interested and have been in World War One for a long time. And, so I am aware that there was a disaster in Halifax. I'm aware that a ship that was bound for the European theater carrying munitions exploded. I'm aware that there was significant loss of life. I may have read more details about it at some point in the past that I don't recall. I've never seen any documentary or any kind of video on it. And so, the only knowledge I have comes through reading. And so, look, I'm very eager to learn more, and let's see what we can find out. Hey guys, I'm filming this right after I've watched the video, and I don't usually do this, but please stay tuned to the end. You will not regret it. He profiles an individual, Halifax telegraph operator named Vince Coleman. You must see his story, I promise you. And don't skip ahead to it either, because you won't really appreciate what he did unless you saw the complete video to understand what happened in this disaster. So please take my word for it. You won't regret it. Like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and I'll see you after the video. Thanks.
Sponsored by Surfshark VPN.
The Halifax explosion, fascinating horror. I hope this is done respectfully. Fascinating horror.
1917, two ships collided in the mouth of Halifax Harbour in Nova Scotia, Canada. The collision sparked a fire on board one of the vessels, a repurposed tramp steamer packed with a cargo of explosives bound for the European theatre of war. At exactly 35 seconds after 9:04
Just used the same terminology I did.
This cargo detonated, bringing about one of the largest non-nuclear explosions ever to take place.
Wait a second. I'm backing up a second.
On the 6th of December, 1917, two ships collided in the mouth of Halifax Harbour in Nova Scotia, Canada. At exactly 35 seconds after 9:04 a.m., this cargo detonated, bringing about one of the largest non-nuclear explosions ever to take place.
Okay. He said what I thought he said. One of the largest non-nuclear explosions ever to take place. Wow, that's shocking. It's also surprising. Just with the strength of the bombs in non-nuclear bombs in World War II, and in all the modern wars, it's just shocking. Oh my God. Okay, let's get to this. This, I think, is going to be a lot worse than I was expecting.
Halifax Harbour is a large, natural harbour on the Atlantic coast of Canada. It consists of a huge enclosed bay, known as the Bedford Basin, as well as a slender strait, known as the Narrows, which leads out towards open ocean, passing a few small islands on the way. On
So
one
if I had
side
to
of
guess,
Halifax
the
Harbour
collision's
in
going to take place in
1917
these
was the
narrows
town
right
of
here.
Halifax. On the other side stood Dartmouth. Between them, the two towns had a combined population of around 65,000 people.
It's very close to land.
This population had recently grown. The ongoing First World War made the harbour of great strategic importance. It was a key departure point for convoys of ships bound for Europe.
I wonder if that's true of U.S. shipping too, because we've shipped over a ton of arms to Europe during the First World War before we were in the war. It seems like Halifax was a natural place for ships to make their final departure from. Just as when we fly to Europe now, we fly first north over Canada first before we head north over the North Atlantic.
It was an incredibly important port, and was thus busier during the war than it ever had been before. A few days before the disaster, the Norwegian ship, the SS Imo, arrived at Halifax Harbour and docked in the Bedford Basin, where it sat for several days
SS
awaiting
Emo,
supplies.
did he say? Emo?
Some of these, namely the ship's required load of coal, were delayed. Although cleared to leave on the 5th of December, the Emo didn't complete loading until too late in the day to depart. Submarine nets, designed to protect the ships at anchor in the Bedford Basin from attack by German U-boats, had been raised for the night, and therefore no ship could pass in or out. Although anxious to get underway, the crew of the Emo would have to wait until the next morning. Meanwhile, the French cargo ship, the SS Mont Blanc, was in a similar predicament outside the harbour. It had arrived too late in the day to be allowed to enter the Bedford Basin, and so was forced to wait outside the harbour until the submarine nets were lowered again the next morning.
So I take it these are the two ships that will collide?
The crew of the Mont Blanc,
Mont
would
Blanc
no doubt have preferred to spend the
and
night
Emo.
with the ship moored safely inside the harbour, especially considering the cargo it carried. On board was a staggering amount of explosive materials, including TNT, gun cotton, picric acid, and barrel upon barrel of tar-like benzol.
Holy jeez. Of course, we all know what TNT is. Dynamite. Gun cotton, used in torpedoes, grenades, and guns. Picric acid, used in shells. And benzol, which used in explosives and vehicle fuel. So that's kind of like a gasoline, I think. Holy moly.
Whatever fears the crew of the Mont Blanc might have had, the night passed uneventfully. At 7:30 a.m. on the morning of the 6th of December, the submarine nets were lowered, and both ships started moving once more, the Emo heading out of Halifax harbour, and the Mont Blanc heading inwards. Normally, ships passing through the Narrows were expected to stay on the right, and to adhere to a speed
Right-of-way
limit of
rules.
just 5 knots, about the pace of a swift jog. On this particular day, though, the captain of the Emo was so keen to get moving that he ignored the speed limit and surged into the Narrows at a much faster speed. At this point, the Emo encountered 2 other vessels, one after the other. First was the SS Clara, an American tramp steamer, coming into the harbour on the wrong side of the Narrows.
American
The
tramp
2 boats
steamer.
signalled to one another, and the Emo ultimately moved towards the middle of the Narrows to avoid a collision.
Oh boy.
Moments later, the Emo encountered the tugboat Stella Maris, which was travelling down the centre of the strait. Again, the Emo moved aside, this time going from a position near the middle of the Narrows to completely the wrong side.
And all still probably at a speed that was exceeding the limitation.
That was how the Emo
Which, I live in a shore town. I've been on boats plenty. There's always coming into a harbor. There's no wake zones and it's for right-of-way rules for good reason.
came to be on a collision course with the inbound Mont Blanc. The 2 ships sighted one another when they were still more than 1.2 kilometres, around 3/4 of a mile, apart, and began a series of frantic signals. The Mont Blanc had right of way, but the crew of the Emo, for whatever reason, indicated that they would not yield.
Why?
When it became clear that the end result of this game of chicken would be a catastrophic collision, both ships cut their engines. The Mont Blanc tried to steer around the drifting Emo, and might have made it had the Emo not reversed its engines at exactly the wrong moment. The effect of this was to cause the nose of the Emo to swing into the hull of the Mont Blanc. The collision took place at a relatively low speed, and although quite damaging, did not immediately scuttle either boat. However, several barrels of the Mont Blanc's flammable cargo were ruptured in the...
It would have been better if the Mont Blanc had been scuttled. Yeah, look at this. The benzol right there.
flash, resulting in a huge spill of highly flammable material. Even at this point, though, a disaster was not yet assured. Without a spark, even the most explosive materials would not catch fire. For a moment, the boats drifted. Then, the Emo's engines kicked in once again, and the 2 damaged vessels parted ways. As they did so, metal scraped upon metal. Sparks flew, and a fire began on board the
Oh,
Mont
that
Blanc.
benzo went up.
Recognizing the danger, the captain of the Mont Blanc, Émile Lemedec, ordered his crew to abandon ship. They needed no further encouragement to do so. Piling into lifeboats, they rowed for the shore, shouting desperate warnings to anyone they could see. Alas, such was the noise and confusion out on the water that very few people on nearby boats or watching from the shore
Is this an actual picture of the
actually
fire?
heard or understood these warnings. The Mont Blanc itself drifted, blazing, towards the Halifax side of the Narrows, eventually beaching itself beside Pier 6 of the harbour. A huge plume of smoke rose into the air above it, and people on both sides of the water were drawn to their windows or to the waterfront
Oh, God,
in order to
no.
watch the drama unfold.
Oh no.
At 9:04 a.m. and 35 seconds, the cargo on board the Mont Blanc detonated. The explosion was a huge one. The blast destroyed everything within 2.6 kilometers, or 1.6 miles, of the...
Destroyed everything within 2.6K? Like a radius of 2.6K. Holy God, that is like a small nuclear explosion.
grounded ship. Beyond that, severe damage was done to thousands of buildings, and hot fragments of metal rained down across the city. A gun from the deck of the Mont Blanc
more than
was
2.5
launched
kilometers
into the air
out.
and touched down again 5.6 kilometers, or 3.5 miles away.
Oh my God.
The shockwave travelled at many times the speed of sound and was felt across the whole of Nova Scotia. Buildings
Holy gosh.
disintegrated, trees were flattened, cars tumbled, and ships lifted completely from the harbour and dumped onto land.
That, jeez, the force of that. Destroy buildings like this, the shockwave, miles and miles away. Lift ships out of the water. Oh my God. Yeah, when I was a kid, living on an island, there was an oil tanker coming into a power plant, and there was an explosion on board the oil tanker, which wasn't even enough to sink it. But our house shook from miles away. The windows rattled, and the whole house shook. We thought it was an earthquake at first. Then you heard the boom, the concussion of the boom, the shockwave, I believe, if I remember right, I mean, it was a long time ago, got there before we heard the explosion. Because I think the shockwave was traveling faster than the speed of sound. And, that was just a relatively minor explosion compared to this. Oh, my Lord.
In the space of a moment, around 1,600 people were instantly killed, and many more were
Jesus.
seriously
That
injured.
destruction.
Victims
It
were
does look
buried
like a
beneath
nuclear
rubble,
explosion.
hit by flying debris, and, in many cases, received serious eye injuries as the windows they had been looking through exploded into shards of glass. As well as the destructive force of the blast, the explosion created a tsunami, a crashing 6-story wall of water that surged into the leveled city, crushing and
God.
drowning many of those who had survived the initial blast. The Emo was one of
my
many
God.
ships swept up by this tsunami. As it was thrown from the harbour, almost everyone on board was killed. Worse yet, as the water receded, fires began to burn in the wreckage. The explosion had destroyed boilers, collapsed factories, and knocked over domestic stoves. Now
Fires
the
throughout the
rubble
city,
caught
probably,
fire,
then.
turning the rescue effort into a race against
Oh,
time.
my God.
Time was not on the side of the rescuers. Since the explosion had taken place in the context of the First World War, the natural assumption of many was that it had been due to enemy action.
Yeah, I could see that. So this was, when was it? December, they said, December 1917. So in 1916, there was an explosion at a munitions depot on an island in New York Harbor, not Manhattan, but a smaller island. And I believe that either the concussion or the sound was heard or felt as far away as Philadelphia, which is 90 miles away. It was a huge explosion, and it was due to German sabotage. One of the several reasons why we ultimately got into the war
Rather than
in
immediately focusing on
1917.
rescue, soldiers ran to their posts to defend against further attack. It was only after some hours had passed that the true source of the explosion was widely understood. Rescue work was grim and lengthy. Firefighters from across the province were joined by police and military, as well as hundreds of shell-shocked volunteers. They dug through the wreckage, pulling out any survivors they could find.
Jesus.
These were sent to the city's remaining medical facilities.
Wait a second, in that picture, was that snow on the ground or ash? What was
A
that?
deluge of thousands of seriously injured casualties arrived at every available hospital in a matter of hours. Several military vessels that had been close at the time of the explosion diverted to offer assistance, and were promptly converted into makeshift hospital ships. Although injured and shocked by what had happened, everyone present did whatever they could to help. There are even reports of children volunteering to carry messages across the town. This rescue effort was, however,
Children
soon
shouldn't have to see
complicated
that.
by worsening weather. The day after the explosion, when hundreds of people were still injured, homeless, and trapped beneath rubble, a blizzard descended on the city, bringing below freezing temperatures and 1.2 meters, or 4 feet, of snow.
Oh my God, they can't catch a break. So you had the initial explosion, killed so many people instantly. You had the concussion. You had the falling, raining debris. You had glass injuries. Then you had fires. And while the rescue effort was underway, you have a blizzard with 4 feet of snow and freezing temperatures, which probably means that a lot of people trapped under the rubble died of exposure, probably scared and in pain and freezing cold. The magnitude of this disaster is way beyond what I thought.
Not only did these horrendous conditions present a challenge for rescuers, but they also stopped relief from reaching the city.
Oh my God.
Trains carrying medical supplies and food were forced to stop in place in zero visibility, even though their supplies were desperately needed within the blast zone.
Oh, that's terrible.
The Halifax explosion, then, was a disaster of many dimensions. As such, the number of dead is difficult to estimate, but stands at around 2,000 in total, with a further 9,000 people suffering serious injury. As soon as the
2,000.
situation on the ground was under control, an inquiry was launched to establish...
Okay, wait a second. Blizzard cuts off Halifax. 20,000 survivors destitute. At least 2,000, maybe more dead. 9,000 injured. Probably seriously injured. Probably, like they said before, a lot of blindness with the eye injuries with the glass, and probably missing limbs and severe burns, frostbite. Oh my
who had been to blame for the incident. It might seem logical that the captain of the Emo was to blame for the disaster. After all, the Emo had been speeding through the Narrows just before the collision. It had been on...
Is this they keep showing this picture of the Emo? I assume this is after the fact. Or it had gotten swept ashore by the tsunami, and then maybe the waters had receded but came back. Is this an after the disaster
the
photo?
wrong side of the strait and had refused to yield even when signalled by the Mont Blanc.
Wait, let me back
After
up.
all,
I'm sorry.
the Emo had been speeding through the Narrows just before the collision. It had been on the wrong side of the strait and had refused to yield even when signalled by the Mont Blanc. However, the presiding judge, Mr. Justice Arthur Drysdale, had little hesitation in blaming the crew of the Mont Blanc, who he
Why?
alleged had failed to follow the rules concerning the movement of ships. There were likely several reasons behind this rather one-sided judgment, not least of which was a great deal of public anger. Given that the crew of the Emo had almost all been killed in the explosion, this anger
Nobody
was
blamed.
focused largely on the surviving crew of the Mont Blanc, who had, after all, abandoned ship in order to save their own lives when the fire...
All right, first of all, what were they supposed to do? It was going to explode anyway, and in fact, it's from what they said before, their abandoning ship at least got them on shore to warn some people. Whether a lot of people understood what the warning was about seems to be in question, but they tried. They were also ordered to abandon ship by their captain. And as terrible and sad it is for the crew of the Emo who all died, it was their captain ultimately who made the decisions, I assume, the terrible piloting decisions through the straits. Oh boy.
Began. 3 men were charged with manslaughter. They included Amy Lemedek, the captain of the Mont Blanc, Francis Mackey, a harbour pilot, and Frederick Evans Wyatt, the chief examining officer of Halifax Harbour. However, none of these men were ever brought to trial, as there simply wasn't enough evidence to do so.
Chief examining officer of Halifax Harbor. Was that because maybe there was not enough control, considering that the Mont Blanc was carrying the munitions it was carrying? Was something different supposed to have been done, and would that have fallen in within his auspices?
In any event, the ruling that the Mont Blanc alone had been at fault was overturned by the Supreme Court of Canada in 1919, and it was established that both ships had made errors which contributed to the disaster.
Really, more than just those 2 ships. You know, I was paying close attention before about what they were saying, and this is just an absolute parade of horrible decision making by a lot of people. You had the captain of the Emo who wanted to get underway quickly, and so just completely disregarded the speed limitations going through the Narrows. You had the American trawler, which was on the wrong side, and so the Emu moved into the center. So right there, you sort of forced their hand, although they both were at wrong there. The captain of the Emo just compounded it by, not slowing down, but shifting into a position where he shouldn't have been. Then you had the tugboat they mentioned that was in the center of the strait, which I also think was the wrong position. And so then the Emo moved over into the entire wrong lane. And then the captain of the Emo refused to yield the right of way to the Mont Blanc, but the Mont Blanc at the same time, knowing that they're carrying all those, dangerous munitions, seemed to play the game of chicken with the Emo for far too long before taking other action. And it's just that parade of absolute terrible decision making by multiple people all came together to combine and result in this horrible, horrible disaster. What a shame.
Despite the devastation,
if just one thing had been different,
some positive outcomes did arise from the disaster. The rules concerning harbour navigation and the storage of hazardous materials were changed to make a repeat of the explosion unlikely. Beyond this, the huge rescue efforts served to inform and bolster charitable organisations within Canada. The massive number of eye injuries caused by flying glass, for example, led directly to the founding of the Canadian National Institute for the Blind a few years later, while the extensive rescue effort underlined the importance of the Red Cross and helped them to grow into the humanitarian organisation they are today.
Really?
In the aftermath of the disaster, there was a huge need for housing, and this led to the construction of one of the first public housing projects in Canada, known as the Hydrostone. Some of the dwellings constructed during this time are still in place today.
Wow, for a public housing project, that's a beautiful building. Look at that. Nice slate roof.
Providing a home to Halifax's modern citizens. One of the most enduring legacies from the disaster is one of civic friendship. Boston was one of the first cities to send aid to Halifax, and this aid arrived at a crucial time, just as the blizzard was setting in. The help provided by Boston was vital in saving lives and relieving medical staff and rescuers. As a thank you for this vital support at the most difficult time in its history, Nova Scotia donated a Christmas tree to the city of Boston. Many years later, this became a tradition, and to this day, Nova Scotia provides Boston with a tree. Though devastated.
It's been 100 years. So this is very interesting, because the request to look at this video came out of a video in which I partially covered Canadians taking care of our citizens in Operation Yellow Ribbon in 9/11. And I'm wondering if this tidbit about Boston helping Halifax during that disaster was why I was asked to look at this. But look, these little stories, the 9/11 stories, not little, but these little stories throughout history of our communities coming together to help one another in times of disaster or times of need just show where. Well, my thoughts were that the these little stories of civic help across our borders during times of need really strengthens the bond between us. And I think it's wonderful that to this day, Nova Scotia recognizes Boston by giving them that Christmas tree annually. I have a daughter that goes to school up there, and so when I pick her up for Christmas vacation, I'm gonna go bring her, and we'll take a look at the tree, and I'll be able to tell her the story.
1917, Halifax has risen from the ruins. Today it is a thriving maritime city, home to more than 400,000 people. The Halifax explosion remains a painful but vital part of its history, and reminders of the suffering, the loss, and the heroism of rescuers are everywhere. Though the city has recovered, the Halifax explosion will never be forgotten.
Nor should it, even 100 years later.
There is one final and at least somewhat positive coda to the story of the Halifax explosion, that of Patrick Vincent Coleman. I'm able to include this story in this extra long episode thanks to the sponsor of today's video, Surfshark VPN, of Patrick Vince Coleman, a man whose actions on the 6th of December 1917 saved an untold number of lives.
Okay.
Vince Coleman was a train dispatcher for Canadian Government Railways. On the day of the disaster, he was working at Richmond Station, not far from Pier 6, where the burning Mont Blanc ran aground. He would have had a clear view of the plumes of smoke rising from the burning vessel, and would no doubt have been deeply alarmed when a sailor dashed up to him and his colleagues to inform them that they must evacuate, as the burning boat was laden with explosives. Coleman and his colleagues, quite understandably, ran for their lives. Before getting very far, however, Coleman turned around and sprinted back to the telegraph office at Richmond Station. From there, he started sending out one final, desperate message. Hold up the train. Ammunition ship afire in harbour, making for Pier 6, and will explode. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys.
I don't even know what to say. He was running for his life, and something triggered in his mind to go back and man his station at the telegraph, obviously knowing that he was going to die. Oh my God, he made a choice to sacrifice his life to save people, to save a train full of people. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys. Were these his last words? Did he? Oh my God.
Coleman's message was most likely intended for one particular train, the overnight express from New Brunswick. This service, carrying around 300 passengers, was due to arrive within just a few minutes, and would have passed directly by the burning Mont Blanc when it did.
Oh my God.
Thanks to Coleman's actions, however, it was halted on the other side of the Bedford Basin, and 300 innocent people lived to see another day. Moreover, his message was relayed to many other stations, instantly halting inbound freight and passenger trains, and also alerting telegraph operators across Nova Scotia and beyond to the impending disaster. When the Mont Blanc exploded, the wheels were already in motion to begin delivering rescuers, supplies, equipment, and aid to the victims of the disaster. Coleman, as he had predicted in his final message, did not survive. The explosion hit him with such force that it blew the hands from his pocket watch. death would have been instant. His legacy, however, lives on, not just in the lives he saved, but in his presence as an enduring figure in history, a symbol of the many heroes who sacrificed themselves during the years of the First World War in order to preserve the lives of others. Today, Coleman's telegraph key and damaged pocket watch are preserved in the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic in Nova Scotia.
Oh man, I want to go
Though
there
he
now.
has been dead for over 100 years, by virtue of actions taken in the final few seconds of his life, Vince Coleman stands to be remembered for centuries to come.
Wow, guys. Oh God, am I glad they did that last part about Vince Coleman. Despite that this is from fascinating horror, and I thought that this was maybe going to be not tastefully done, it was incredibly tastefully done, very well done. I had no idea the scale of that disaster and the absolute utter horror of it. But the fact that they profiled Vince Coleman at the end there, and this is not a guy I'm ever going to forget. How do I put this in words? It is incredibly touching to me. I'm going to be thinking about this for days, but incredibly touching to me that he was running for his life. And how does a person who's got that flight instinct already, running from danger, stop themselves to go back into danger knowing that they were probably going to die? And he obviously did by his telegraph message. What kind of character and courage does that take to choose to save a train full of people and what turned out to be a lot more than that by giving up your own life for it? Young man, handsome man, the prime of his life. It's just, why it's important, and why I'm glad he did it. And these are the words I've been struggling to find, because this was set in World War I, right? And so there were so many millions of people died. There were in the war, a lot of them committing acts of heroism. Thousands of people died in this disaster, and I'm sure more than Vince Coleman committed acts of heroism. But those are all just numbers and statistics. It's personalizing a story like Vince Coleman's story that makes us remember that those statistics were real people. Every one of them had a story. Every one of them had a family. Every one of them had a life worth living. And because of their self-sacrifice, they're no longer with us, and their lives were cut short, but the many lives that they saved went on, hopefully to have earned it and lived good lives and had children who did good things. And it puts a face on the numbers, and I'm so glad that they did that. I'll never forget the name Vince Coleman. All right, guys. Thank you so much for this. Thank you. Really appreciate it.